All right, I'll once again offer my welcome to those of you on the call today, joining us for the March edition of the Northwest Gas Association's monthly webinar series. We're excited today to welcome Xing Wong with GTI Energy. Xing serves as the Executive Director of GTI Energy's Net Zero Infrastructure Program, which he's here to share about with us. I really love this program. From my perspective, it's about casting a vision for the future of how we utilize the vast natural gas delivery infrastructure that exists across North America in the context of a decarbonized world. So hopefully I'm not stealing your thunder, Xing, when I say that, but it's a terrific way to think about things. It's really a framework for us to move forward, for our industry to move forward. So really appreciate that. Couple of reminders as we get into the webinar today. First of all, please keep your microphones muted. We do encourage you to ask questions, but to type them in the chat box. Y'all are familiar by now after a couple of years of COVID and lots of virtual meetings. Who knew before COVID that one of our favorite phrases would be "you're on mute"? But you are on mute, and we'd like you to stay that way. So use that chat box to enter your questions in. I'll be monitoring that. And if you enter a question in for Xing, I'll interrupt him as he takes a breath and ask the question for you. But please do engage with us today. Also, we're recording the webinar today, so you can share it. It'll be on our Northwest Gas Association YouTube channel, probably later this afternoon or tomorrow, but we encourage you to share it around with people that you think might have an interest. So the last thing I'll just note for you is our next webinar is Thursday, April 18th, and synergizing security, integrating physical and cyber defense strategies with the experts at the American Gas Association. They do a lot of good work with our member companies and cyber experts in those security, physical and cyber security experts in our member companies and others. And I think you'll find it a really fascinating webinar and hope you'll register to join us then. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and turn the controls over to Xing. And thank you again for being with us today. And the floor is yours. Are
Great.
you on?
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, really excited to be here today to talk to you about the Net Zero Infrastructure Program. Can you see my screen and the slides?
Yes, sir. We sure can.
Great. So just to take a step back and to, I guess, this is what we start off with, was trying to explain to others why GTI Energy decided to start something like this, is that from our perspective, despite the fact that, a lot of the decarbonization technologies that we think about that will help us on the journey to net zero, like hydrogen, direct air capture, carbon capture storage, it's all been supercharged by US policy and federal incentives. We see and forecast that there are going to be a lot of concerns about how we build out this infrastructure. And this can come from the ability to secure permits, financing, the sort of community support for new infrastructure that has to be built out in terms of where it's going, the environmental impacts, plus also the concerns of new fuels in different areas. And as we've seen in sort of research papers about hydrogen and its perhaps indirect warming effect as it interacts with methane, plus RNG and how supposedly how renewable or how scalable it is. We think that there's going to be a lot of polarization around these solutions and how we build out this infrastructure from now and how we think about our net zero energy systems. And so once those challenges come to light, and these are really difficult challenges that I think will take time to build out, we anticipate in GTI that that's going to be a paradigm shift to essentially urgently consider how to best leverage and evolve our existing natural gas infrastructure across the value chain. we started the net zero infrastructure program because we saw this disconnect between what the gas infrastructure is doing in the US today to support the energy systems and the economics of the economy versus what we see in net zero models out in 2050, where, you know, the sort of role of natural gas is much lower, um, well, very, very minimal, and sort of how we think about the choices that different stakeholders have to make about business plans like utilities, like investors, the midstream companies, about how they look at their business model versus those 2050 things, which, there's going to be lots of different pathways to get there. And so the goal of NZIP is to sort of provide an imagined opportunity for how the gas infrastructure can still play a very useful role um, out in these decarbonization pathways, um, and sort of to accommodate the different scenarios that might play out in the net zero um, and the path to net zero. And so, we're starting off with, and people don't appreciate how um, extensive, how much value that's been invested into the US gas infrastructure network. It's really blessed with sort of, here's, you can see 3 million miles of pipeline that connect different regions across the US. Um, Also, from a storage systems that provides economic flexibility, the sort of ability to flex in high demand scenarios and throughout the year and seasonal demand. The infrastructure network, which we consider to be those pipelines, those storage systems, the ability to have gas flowing to different areas of the country depending on energy needs, it's really underappreciated. And when we see models and policies that don't take into this sort of value of the existing natural gas infrastructure into consideration, it really worries us because we think that there that as we said, those infrastructure challenges to those new fuels or new decarbonization solutions are going to take a lot of time. And so we launched NZIP around this vision that stayed sort of very true from the very beginning of what we see to be the goals of integrated net zero energy systems, where they have to continue to be reliable. I just tuned in today to the sort of nominations for the FERC commissioners, and reliability of the objective of keeping energy systems reliable is sort of sometimes missed when we think about the net zero emissions pathways, but that is essential to those systems. They have to continue to be safe and resilient, especially when we think about extreme weather events. Sustainable, we definitely need to reduce the emissions of these systems, but also continue to be affordable. And when we think about the costs of the new infrastructure, I can't think of the research gap that exists that we're trying to address, of how you actually make use of the infrastructure that's already there and see how that could be evolved or repurposed for these sort of low carbon alternative fuels. And that's why our research area that we're trying to address, that white space per se, is to understand what is that scope and extent and technical R&D that's required to repurpose infrastructure. How can that infrastructure accommodate reduced carbon intensity fuel? And we've recognized that a research program like NZIP that's focused around gas infrastructure that can be very polarizing, it's polarized between stranded assets versus locking in further fossil fuels. There is a real question about, as you think about the transition of gas infrastructure and gas systems, what that means for communities from a reliability and cost point of view, but also from a workforce development point of view. And so that's something we wanted to integrate into this research program. But also, something like this has to accommodate and bring together different voices. And so we've, as you'll see in the next slide, brought together a bunch of utilities across the country, and midstream companies, but we've also convened investors and NGOs in this advisory committee to help inform the perspective. They have very different views to perhaps industry, and we outreach a lot to regulators and trying to bring on local communities to inform this vision of what the gas infrastructure can play out to 2050. And so that's really what we created together at GTI Energy with our partners, to really put something out there that is credible, to help inform that there's still a need for existing and new gas pipelines and related energy infrastructure, because our thesis is that making use of what's there is going to be a lot better than decommissioning this and having to build new things, especially for such nascent industries that are still very much supported by federal subsidies at the moment. And these are the partners that we've joined that have joined NZIP. And I think from the list that Judy provided me in the beginning, we recently had TC Energy join. Northwest Natural was a partner last year, and we're still looking for partners across the country, because this kind of the research program to inform the gas infrastructure, that's going to be different across different regions across the US. You guys face different regional considerations, also different policy structures and regulatory requirements. But there's a huge opportunity, I think, for us to help inform policy and investments into energy systems, as we explore that tension between sort of emission reductions and maintaining what we think are key characteristics of energy systems. This is the advisory committee that we've convened, and we put a lot of work into this. So NZIP only launched in June of last year, and we spent the whole summer trying to bring together this advisory committee, to bring together the likes of Environment Defense Fund, RMI, and Clean Task Force are also participating, but they didn't want all their logos to be shown. But having them participate in the development of this research, and help advise on viewpoints that we may not necessarily see at GTI Energy, or our partners will share what we'll see as well. It's really important. It's something that we've definitely learned as a research collaboration from the others that we've launched in terms of Veritas, and the Hope Open Hydrogen Initiative, where it's something that GTI Energy is really good at, of convening and collaborating with very different types of stakeholders, because we think, even though it does take a lot of time to listen to perspectives and consider and bring it all together to something that everyone will agree with. Not everyone always agrees with things, but that incremental step forward is what we sort of really believe in.
Hey, Xing, can I ask a question here? This is actually my question for you. So, if I'm being candid, I would say that you listed a couple of folks that you're consulting with that, in my experience, representing the gas utilities and pipelines out here, don't seem to be interested in actually having constructive conversations about in this vein. So can you elaborate a little bit? I mean, I'm a big proponent of diversity and engaging with folks with even opposing viewpoints, as long as they really are committed to being constructive in the end. And I'm just curious if you're finding that, or if you're really more using this as kind of help us sort of be aware of where where the vulnerabilities in what we're doing might lie. I just I don't know if I'm being very
No,
eloquent what I'm
it's a fair,
trying to express here, but yeah.
it's an absolutely fair question. I think where I'd like our relationship to go with sort of those partners is a lot more of a deeper level, but at the moment, it is sort of like highlighting as to us those perspectives that we may not see. I mean, I guess concrete examples are with the first white paper that we did last year. The likes of RMI and CalSTRS, and the Bipartisan Policy Center provided us feedback that we definitely considered and responded to. And so I think it is a matter of creating the space for them to see what we are developing. And I think, as you'll see in our plans for this year, when we sort of start working and get to a regional case study that can showcase the use and value of continuing to have gas systems, and that you need to still strategically invest in these systems. Within those organizations, there are people who understand that more nuanced level of, it's going to be a lot more expensive if you completely exclude what is already doing a lot at the moment. Publicly, I think they're like, I can't show those logos because it goes against their public positions. But I think they're very interested in understanding how we do this and balancing the viewpoints of sort of what they might see as opposing to their positions.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And we have a governance structure here where I won't spend too much time on this slide, where quarterly I chair a board committee where the program sponsors and NZIP leadership team meet to go through strategic priorities and progress on initiative activities. We have a monthly technical committee that's chaired by Shadi, who's our NZIP technical director, and that's more on sort of engaging on specifics of the research work. And so for the sort of first research white paper, which I'll touch upon in the slides too, it talks about the gas infrastructure and emissions and what we see as deep decarbonization pathways. We got a lot of feedback on a more technical level of what is feasible or what is in terms of those cost benchmarks or what kind of projects have been done to repurpose pipelines. And then we also convene ad hoc on an ad hoc basis, that advisory committee to, I guess, provide review or input for very specific key things like the review of the first white paper, but also as we developed the scope of the regional case studies and what scenarios to include and what informs, I guess, how much weight to put behind certain policies or regulations or the extent that the natural gas supply chain emissions can go down. That has been a very useful conversation. And so we launched in June, and these are just the key highlights from what we've managed to achieve in so 6 to 9 months. We started the year with 8 industry partners, and we started 2024 with 25. NZIP's focus is really also about trying to bridge different perspectives in collaborations like this. And so being able to, I take your point, Dan, on this, and it is echoed in other sort of conversations I have with other NZIP sponsors too. But we do think it's very valuable for them to be involved in the way they are versus a customer or just a observer of what this is. We take their comments very seriously, and we also want them to collaborate more closely with us. And so in the regional case study which we're starting for the Gulf Coast, Cleaner Task Force's Gulf Coast team is also working more closely with us and sort of understanding in the working group 3, which is about policy and social considerations. They're working together with us to, I guess, analyze and understand what the current landscape of decarbonization policies are in the Gulf Coast and what could be perhaps addressed to support whatever the Gulf Coast regional case studies model outputs. We do a lot of outreach, something like this, but we also held our first sort of repurposing infrastructure event at Stanford in the late fall of last year. And we also go and speak to as many people as we can about the value of the gas infrastructure and how it really is important to deeply consider how that system may play different kinds of roles depending on what the technology development and cost curves may look like. And we also did talk to the Bipartisan Policy Center Initiative Future of Natural Gas. So we're really trying to get the message out there of what we think it needs to be really addressed. We can put all this money into the hydrogen hubs and the DAC hubs, but it's not necessarily a sure thing. And so continuing to invest and maintain and reduce the emissions of the existing natural gas system is still very key. In terms of data, something like NZIP that isn't really focused on a fuel, like it's not just focused on hydrogen or RNG or CO2, it's focused on infrastructure. We did a lot of work to integrate and rationalize the data that we have in GTI, but also publicly and also from whatever sort of if one of the sponsor companies was willing to give us their own data, we anonymize it as well. So we've done a lot of work to rationalize that and understand how to sort of take the data that GTI is also part of, the Low Carbon Resources Institute initiative, I think. And they have done a bunch of cost benchmarking data too, so that's integrated into NZIP. And we released this first white paper on natural gas infrastructure in the United States evolving towards a net zero emissions future. And what this paper is public is on the website. It covers the landscape of natural gas and the existing infrastructure, the extent of that, how that demand. I mean, this stuff may not, it's probably, stuff that you already know, but a lot of people that we talk to don't know just how extensive the infrastructure is, how the demand varies unequally across the US, and also just how old some of that systems may be and the emissions associated with it. Like, what are the considerations or factors that influence the emission rates? And then we outline why and what these pathways are that we see as key to decarbonizing the infrastructure, um, and then touch upon the social and policy impacts and implications of linking these decarbonization pathways with the current existing gas infrastructure, focusing a little bit more on leak detection and efficiency programs. So you'll find this white paper on our NZIP website under resources. And if interested, I can also forward on a recording link of the webinar we did for this paper. And
Yeah, I might
the,
just pause you right there,
sure.
Xing, just if you could put it in the chat, that'd be great, or we could share it with people afterwards. But just a reminder to folks, if you have questions or requests, as Xing is continuing through his process, please use the chat function to let us know. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. And I can definitely put that in the chat once I find where that chat function is. But I only have 1 or 2 slides left to go, and I can then do that once I stop sharing slides. The goal of NZIP, so the first white paper really lays out, I think, in a lot more detail what the vision that we see is for the gas infrastructure and the different components that may play a part in influencing that role for the gas infrastructure. But the goal now and for the next couple of years is to start doing a bunch of research and modeling work to put out regional case studies for how the what the role of current and future U.S. gas infrastructure could be in energy transition pathways to net zero emissions by mid-century at the national and subnational level. So we've split the US into these 5 regions, which follow the PAD sort of framework, the Petroleum Administration for Defense thing, but mainly follows that same sort of delineation of the states, recognizing that we recognize in NZIP that the West Coast and East Coast and North and South parts are going to be quite different as well. Their access to different energy supplies and the weather and geographical considerations are very different. So we may have to do a bit more on separating out those 2 pieces. But we're focusing on the Gulf Coast first because, one, it's where there's a lot of data. There's a lot of it's one of the highest sort of methane emissions regions, and also it dovetails well with the hydrogen hubs that GTI Energy is part of as well. And so there's just a lot of overlap that makes it sort of easier to start off with as a first case study. But the goals of these regional case studies is to do a techno-economic and feasibility assessment of what repurposing that existing gas infrastructure could look like for those portfolio of solutions that are laid out in the first white paper, but also then to look at what those R&D and technology development needs are, plus looking at with a view to what regulations may still need to be developed or detailed to allow that gas infrastructure to transform in a line of emission reduction goals. And
Xing,
this,
I have another
go ahead.
question here. Gosh, I'm the one asking all the questions, I guess, on this map here. So as I look at the West Coast, you know, every one of these regions makes pretty well. I mean, I guess you could divide the East Coast up into Northeast and Southeast, but every one of these other regions kind of makes sense. But the West Coast, you know, Oregon and Washington are pretty temperate. California, Nevada, and Arizona have giant, well, California for sure, giant populations and more desert territory. And I just wonder if Washington and Oregon are lumped in with them, what is that? You know, is this census tract and it's easiest to go that way, or how come you, because of course, I suppose every region would tell you, well, we're unique, but the Pacific Northwest kind of is. It's operates on a system where everybody kind of shares the same infrastructure. We have a cold and a temperate side, and a populated side and a less populated side. And I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, but that feels like, gosh, there's like 2 very distinct geographic, weather, and population identities in that one region.
Yes, and it's a point echoed in the East Coast too, I think. But the my understanding of why EIA PAD does it this way is based on the gas infrastructure sort of, I guess, organization of across the country. So we've done this not around the sort of population centers, but around how easy it is to, I guess, gather the boundaries of the national gas infrastructure system and how you separate it out. But we do recognize that in the West Coast, as you said, those two northern states are very different. It's a balance between trying to do the modeling work that will help inform national conversations about gas infrastructure systems and the value of natural gas, versus how granular we get and not being able to put out enough that will help influence those conversations. And so this is sort of that balance that we've tried to strike.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just kind of noting that. So
Yes, and then I think in our plan, so this is also one of the things that the, the getting to those outputs is what we want to do, but the work that's going into this is actually also fairly new. When we look and interrogate the net zero models of they're like out there that people like Princeton has done or MIT, they don't have much consideration for existing infrastructure. We spoke to Evolve Energy, and then all of these net zero studies, these consultancies, and one of the key ones is something called like Evolve Energy. And when we talk to them about how they incorporate existing information, because everything is sort of deterministic, and we understand why. But when they have a scenario, the breakthrough energy sort of, I think it's called annual decarbonization perspectives, have different scenarios, and one of them is sort of saying maximizing the use of existing infrastructure. But in reality, the way they model it is sort of just penalizing the build out of new infrastructure in terms of time and costs. But in terms of that technical understanding of what actually of the pipelines that we have or the systems that we have that could be continued to be reused or repurposed, that doesn't really exist at that level. And so what we're trying to do in NZIP is try to, I guess, change the way that we think about net zero pathways to have more consideration of what is already existing and what's already delivering energy to different systems, so that we're not going through this huge, everyone talks about a managed transition, but if you don't have the understanding of what there is now and how you can work from there, I think that's the gap that NZIP's really trying to address. And the last thing is, with the way that we're doing the regional case studies, in terms of the stepwise sequence, part of it is modeling in those regions the sort of cost and feasibility of RNG, of hydrogen, of where the carbon capture can go, with also a business as usual case. And then with those pathways defined, do it through a cost optimized pathway that allows sort of different selections of these things to get to the least cost model. And then the idea is to get that pathway in terms of the economics compared against what may be out there in other research spheres of fully electrified pathways. That's the idea behind these regional case studies.
and then I have another question here, and that is, I'm just going to make the assumption, and I'm looking for affirmation from you that that GTI Energy, as it does these engages in these regional case studies, will deeply involve its member companies or contributing companies in those discussions, because they have a vested interest in the outcome, right? So
Yes. So in those technical committee meetings, we are at the moment really diving into the scenarios and scope of what they want to be included in the study. And then once we have each of those interim results, it'll be shared with the companies as well and iterated upon before we get to that cost optimized sort of pathway final result. Thanks, Dan. Any questions from others too? Happy to take. And the last slide is just really to outline the timeline of what we're doing in Q1, which is ending soon. We're going through that scoping, and we've decided to partner. When we think about the sort of expertise available at GTI versus what was be required to do one of those regional case studies, GTI doesn't really actually have a systems model, but we have the technology expertise, we have the systems thinking, and so we've partnered with some researchers at MIT who have a model, and they're using that model at the moment in the National Petroleum Council hydrogen study, and they're adapting that with the sort of infrastructure information that GTI already has. And so Q1 is about just setting up the entire sort of resourcing and study for that, going through the modeling and the analysis for the next sort of 3 to 4 months. And really the goal is to complete all this work at the end of this year and start a second region by the end of the year. And these just lays out, again, NZIP is not just about trying to do a technical report and putting it out there, but really trying to educate and outreach on how important the gas infrastructure is at the moment and how it can still be important. So these are just a list of different outreach events that we're continuing to do. And this Q3 thing, it's part of our strategic plans for the regional case studies, is to at least have, as part of the conversation or discussion or way of getting feedback, is holding regional workshops with stakeholders in those regions to present preliminary findings, get feedback on those assumptions, and what other things might be missing or having to be incorporated into the final analysis.
So one